Hello and welcome everyone to episode 27, Remastered. Today is going to be really fun because I'm going to tell you the story of the Mesozoic era, or the Age of Reptiles, where dinosaurs were the dominant creatures on the planet. This era is split into three periods, called the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, which I'm sure you know by heart if you were enthusiastic about dinosaurs as a kid. Now, in the previous episodes covering the evolutionary history of life on Earth, I began with the 3 billion years of the Precambrian era, which began with the formation of the Earth, and was followed by the boiling oceans cooling down, and life arising in the form of single-celled organisms. In the later stages of the Precambrian, we came to the Ediacara era, where life had evolved into primitive animals like hydra and sponges and jellyfish. This would lead to the Cambrian explosion, which was a blossoming of animal diversity. The Cambrian explosion began the Paleozoic era, which lasted for close to 300 million years, and during this time, life had diversified to fill the oceans. There was the Age of Fish in the Devonian period, and only in the later years of the Paleozoic did the vertebrates crawl out of the water to spread out over dry land, joining the arthropods, the land plants, and the fungus that had preceded them. This led to the creation of new ecosystems with woody plants, huge insects, and the first ancestors of the reptiles and amphibians. These early primitive tetrapods grew larger to fit their environment, only for 70% of them to be destroyed, along with 97% of marine species, in what was known as the Permian-Triassic extinction event. This event was a terrible scourge upon the Earth, and for good reason it's called the Great Dying. But after this extinction event, just like all other extinctions, and even though this was a really big one, life would rebound and re-diversify to fill the empty ecological space that has been left open. This rebounding from the Great Dying would begin the Mesozoic era, which itself began with the Triassic period. At this time, the world's landmass was still organized into the supercontinent Pangaea, although from this point on, the continents would begin to slowly break apart, and over the next 250 million years, they would move into the places that they are today. But in the early Triassic, 252 million years ago or so, Pangaea was the world. It held vast expanses of inland that saw huge temperature fluctuations, from savage cold in the winter to brutal, unforgiving heat in the summer. Along the coasts of Pangaea, the water modulated the climate and kept the temperatures from reaching extremes. But this difference between coastal and inland temperatures would have led to heavy storms and monsoons. In these conditions, life struggled for tens of millions of years, deep into the mid-Triassic, as it tried to recover from the Great Dying. After this cataclysmic event 252 million years ago, entire ecosystems had been thoroughly destroyed, as plant and animal species in all sorts of niches went extinct, and the climate was radically altered. The largest animals of the late Paleozoic era were almost entirely wiped out, and much of the marine life was killed off by low oxygen content in the oceans and high temperatures. There is significant geological evidence that suggests that the Earth was barren and particularly brutal during this time period. For example, when large quantities of plant biomass grow and then die, and then grow and die again and grow and die, their tissues will accumulate on the forest floor faster than they can be broken down. Over geologic timespans, sediment and rock will cover up these massive decomposing forests, and the pressure will compress the biomass into coal. There are coal deposits that exist throughout geologic time, throughout the geologic record, particularly from the early Carboniferous period, when there weren't any microbes or fungus to break down the lignin in the plant's tissues. In contrast to this, there are virtually no coal deposits anywhere that have been found during the early Triassic, which would suggest that there was relatively little plant biomass available. So stark is this total lack of coal that geologists have called it the coal gap. Fossilized riverbeds also give clues to the aridity and the barrenness of the time period. When a river flows through a region with dense vegetation, the roots of all of the plants and trees and stuff will help to hold the ground together. They'll create a clump of dense, stabilized earth that the water will flow around. This creates a ribbon of water, a continuous stream that meanders its way through the landscape. It'll do loops and back and forths and curves and ribbon motions. But when there aren't any plants, there's no extensive root systems to hold the soil together. The mineral topsoil can be easily washed away by rain or floods, and this can accumulate in rivers that become thick with sediment. In addition, the banks of a river are very erodible when there's no roots to hold it all together, and so the banks can break apart and the river can break over its traditional boundary and spill across a new land surface. So it can break up meandering rivers and turn them into braided rivers, which are they're rivers composed of many small streams that overlap and intersect as they slowly drain across a wide area. Fossilized riverbeds from the early Triassic are mostly braided, which would suggest that this barren, plant-devoid type of landscape was quite common. The marine and terrestrial animal species that survived the extinction event stabilized their populations around 5 to 6 million years into the Triassic period. They made new ecosystems, which at first were small and rudimentary, composed of only a handful of surviving species and their immediate descendants, interacting however they could. These ecosystems wouldn't fully recover until nearly 30 million years into the Triassic. The extinction event also sculpted life in the oceans dramatically, making some body plans and species behaviors more advantageous and others less so. For example, selection pressures promoted movement, as species like snails and crabs outcompeted the more stationary species of filter feeders. This was most likely due to the fact that plant life had become rare, which diminished the populations of species that ate the plants for food. This effect went up the food chain, shrinking populations as they starved for lack of sufficient prey. Those organisms who were stationary could only eat what came near them, and if they weren't exposed to enough food, that was it. There was nothing they could do. They would starve. Considering there was a general lack of plant matter, of plant detritus, and because the animal populations were dwindling as well, so there was a lack of animal detritus, it sounds like these stationary populations really wouldn't have been coming into nearly as much food as they might have been used to. This would have put a heavy selection pressure on organisms that could move, that could squirm or swim or crawl around somehow. These more mobilized creatures would be able to seek out food, and in this way avoid starvation. For much of the early Triassic, life in the oceans was a disaster. As huge swaths of the marine community had been rendered completely extinct, stable ecosystems were a thing of the past. They were unheard of at this point in time. The massive coral reefs that had characterized the sea in the Devonian period were now, in the Triassic, nothing more than small patches of coral, shameful parodies of the reefs that they once were. Of the few species that survived the Great Dying, many would go on to fill the empty oceans through diversification and speciation. They would go on to fill these empty niches and attempt to recreate ecosystems. This would include the ammonites, which were large cephalopods that bore massive curving shells, with their tentacle-covered face protruding from the bottom. It also includes a variety of aquatic reptiles, typically long-tailed, serpent-like creatures with paddles or broad hands that have been adapted for swimming, including the placodont, the plesiosaur, and the viciously successful ichthyosaurs. These ichthyosaurs were serious business. They were massive predators with huge bodies and powerful fins, made all the more deadly by a long snout lined with teeth. The ichthyosaurs are terrifying beasts, like some eldritch combination of a reptile and a shark. The ichthyosaurs are now extinct, but their lineages spent a good 150 million years or so hunting through the Mesozoic oceans. Large plants were mostly wiped out by the Great Dying, so those species that clung to the surface were smaller and hardier, able to endure the droughts and other tough environmental conditions that were present at the time. Some of these early plants include the ginkgo, ferns, and horsetails. The seed plants, like seed-bearing ferns and conifers, came to dominate the landscape. Vast forests of conifers carpeted the more moderate regions of the world, and in time they spread out to reach as far as the North and South Poles. This is because, during this time period, the world was very hot, and it's believed that there wasn't any ice on the poles at all. In fact, the polar regions were believed to have been so warm that these temperate forests were thriving ecosystems that were even home to a few reptiles. From a general perspective, the clade reptilia dominated the entire Mesozoic period, including the Triassic. This was because they had several adaptations that made them well suited to the climate, but also because the competition was kind of struggling. Amphibians are a particularly fragile group of creatures, and when the climate and the ecosystems had changed so drastically after the Great Dying, many species failed to keep up. A huge majority of the amphibians dwelling on land, including the large, giant amphibians that had dominated the late Paleozoic, they were wiped out, with various species of reptile coming in to fill their empty ecological niche. Almost all of the surviving amphibian species were aquatic or semi-aquatic, preferring the coastal regions, the swamplands, marshes, lakes, rivers, and even open ocean. Amphibian species continued to go extinct throughout the early Triassic, with only a handful able to make it into the Cretaceous. Now, understand that when I'm talking about these amphibians, I'm not really talking about your cute little salamanders or tree frogs. I'm talking about the massive, hulking monsters with slimy, pseudo-scaled skin and broad, flat skulls. Some of these amphibians, like the Mastodonsaurus, could grow more than a dozen feet long. There was a few species of reptile that thrived in the early Triassic, only to die out before the period came to an end. Such species include the large rhynchosaurs, which as far as we can tell, looked sort of like a giant mole rat. They were basically large, hairless reptiles with broad, lumpy heads and a mouth that was tipped with two massive fangs, held close together like rat fangs, except longer and wider. These teeth were like plates, and instead of eating meat, the rhynchosaurs used them to strip leaves from plants. They had teeth lining the roof of their mouths, which helped tear up plant tissue and ready it for digestion. These rhynchosaurs were, for a brief period between 240 and 220 million years ago, the most common large grazing herbivores on the planet, growing up to 2 meters in length and existing almost everywhere, in almost every habitat, but they died out when they were eventually outcompeted by newly emerged species. Other reptiles were able to persist, lasting for much longer than the mid-Triassic, and they created lineages that lasted deep into the Jurassic or even the Cretaceous periods. Some of these longer-lasting reptilian lineages were the archosaurs and the theropods. The archosaurs are the ancestors of both birds and crocodiles, and at the time they were much like the crocodiles of today, with long snouts lined with socketed teeth, a thick midsection, and a heavy tail supported by short, scaly legs, and a preference for semi-aquatic habitats like rivers, marshes, and coastal lowlands. The theropods are clade within the archosaurs, most closely related to the sauropods. Now, the theropods were bipedal predators, but for much of the Triassic they would remain relatively small and confined to lurking through the underbrush. They would, however, begin to adapt to become more bipedal and less quadrupedal, so they started to use their hind legs more often for locomotion and their forelimbs more often for manipulating stuff. This would lay the physiological groundwork for the larger theropods, like the Tyrannosaurus rex or the Velociraptor, to name the two most well-known examples. There was a non-reptilian group called the cynodonts that appeared during the Permian period, but they survived the Great Dying to recover and thrive in the Triassic. These cynodonts are the ancestors of mammals, and they were unique from the reptiles in that they had bodies covered in fur, with legs that stood straight up for better locomotion and motility, and they had a warm-blooded metabolism. These early cynodonts were relatively small, similar in shape to the rhynchosaurs I mentioned earlier. They had the shape of a really squat, hairless dog, or like a lizard mixed with a dog. They had mammalian heads, with bulging brain cases and large zygomatic arches under their eyes as sites of attachment for the jaw muscles, and they had tails that were either narrow or thin, unlike the bulkier tails of their reptilian cousins. The cynodonts were small because they suffered from competition with various reptile groups, but primarily from the archosaurs, who are also amniotic animals that were able to inhabit much of the same territory as these proto-mammal cynodonts. This competition with the archosaurs pushed the cynodonts into the underbrush, into the shadows, ecologically speaking, forcing them to eat a diet of insects and adapt a metabolism to match their small bodies. Their warm blood and their metabolism would have made it necessary for them to evolve some more sophisticated mechanism to regulate their temperature, and part of this involved the evolution of fur. So all of these reptiles, as well as all of the amphibians and the proto-mammals, and all of the plant life and fungal life, and all of the aquatic life that existed at the time, all of this life had about 50 million years to rebuild its ecosystems and to thrive and enjoy life, before they were hit head first by the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event that took place about 200 million years ago. The world's ecosystems had only been fully stabilized for 20 million years, and then this next massive extinction event comes along and screws everything up again. However, this extinction event wasn't nearly as bad as the Great Dying, or the Permian-Triassic extinction, but it was still pretty devastating, particularly to life in the oceans. It isn't really well understood what might have caused this extinction, although it's postulated that it could have been caused by massive volcanic activity that literally shattered the Pangaean supercontinent and initiated the expansion of the continents that created the world map that we know and love today. Some species were able to pass through the extinction event unfazed, their fossils displaying almost no noticeable changes or adaptations in response to the devastation. Other species underwent dramatic evolutionary change, while others simply couldn't keep up, and they would join those who fell into extinction. Many dinosaur species, like the Attosaurs, experienced little to no evolutionary change, as did many conifers and seed-bearing plants that were hardy enough to endure whatever struggle it was that was causing the extinction. Many cynodonts, however, were radically changed by the extinction event, as massive populations were wiped out in the northern regions of Pangaea. The cynodont physiology responded more pliably to the evolutionary pressures of the time than did the archosaurs or the Attosaurs. The archosaurs underwent a fascinating change. Almost all of them died out, with the exception of one lineage that would go on to become the crocodiles, and another lineage of the Ornithodira archosaurs, whose lineage would continue to perpetuate itself to become the true dinosaurs, and then, even farther in the future, the birds. The extinction event wiped out almost all the large amphibian species, as well as many large mammal species, and a huge bulk of the life in the sea. It really seems like with every mass extinction event, life in the sea just takes a really hard hit. Anyways, this brings us to the Jurassic period, which lasted from the extinction event about 200 million years ago up until about 145 million years ago, meaning that the Jurassic period lasted for just a little over 50 million years. During this time period, the supercontinent Pangaea began to break apart, forming two massive daughter continents, that of Laurasia in the north, which was composed of modern-day Europe, Asia, and North America, and the continent Gondwana in the south, composed of modern-day South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia. As Pangaea broke apart, its coastal borders grew and grew. No longer was Pangaea a huge, impenetrable landmass, with vast, landlocked expanses far from any major ocean or lake. Because the land was breaking up and the coastlines were creeping deeper and deeper into the inland, the climate-regulating effects of the ocean began to have a greater influence on the smaller continents, and this made the global climate much more humid. As wet wind and rain clouds could now reach more dry land, the world became like it was in the Devonian. Hot and humid, choked with vegetation in the forms of swamps and jungles and rainforests. The world had changed once again, and the crocodile-morph archosaurs, the ancestors of the crocodiles, found themselves to be less adapted to this new humid environment than they were to the dry heat of the Triassic. These archosaur crocodilians were pushed to the side by the dinosauromorphs, the early dinosaurs, whose evolution would accelerate as they diverged to spread across the two new continents and fill out all of the niches left open from the recent extinction. I'll talk about the dinosaurs in more detail in just a moment, but first, let me cover the developments of marine and plant life during this time period. The frightening ichthyosaurs had survived the end Triassic extinction, alongside other marine reptiles like the long-necked plesiosaurs and some subgroups of crocodiles. Other marine reptiles would appear and thrive during the Jurassic, including the ancestors of turtles. Perhaps most importantly, groups of organisms like plankton experienced a population explosion, where they rapidly proliferated, diversified, and radiated throughout the oceans. The plankton became ubiquitous in the Jurassic oceans, and their ubiquity made them a staple food source for all manner of aquatic organisms. The coral reefs would continue to grow, really coming into their own as superdense ecologies, punctuating the otherwise barren ocean floor. The plants also did well during the Jurassic period, as it was much more comfortable for them now than it was in the Triassic, what with its dry air and temperature extremes across the stretches of continental land that characterized Pangaea. Now that the world had become much more humid during the Jurassic, the planet's temperature was much more stable, less prone to the temperature extremes that were so common in the deep inland areas. The most prominent group of plants during the Jurassic were the conifers, which had spread across much of the planet in great towering forests. Beneath the tree canopies, but above their gnarled roots, the forest floor was a soft carpet of mosses and liverworts, with larger seed ferns crowding around the trees. Cycads grew in the tropical regions, developing huge leaves like Hawaiian palm fronds, while the ginkgo became widespread across the northern hemisphere. This humid, heavily forested environment characterized the world of the Jurassic period, the world that the dinosaurs explored and dominated. Because of the dense vegetation that seemed to carpet the entire planet, herbivores were particularly common. This time period is a veritable golden age for the large herbivorous sauropods, including dinosaurs like the Diplodocus, the Apatosaurus, and the well-known Brachiosaurus. All of these species were some of the largest organisms to ever walk across the surface of the Earth. Their legs were like massive tree trunks. Their torsos were thick and heavy. They possessed freakishly long tails, which were heavy columns of bone and muscle meant to counterbalance their equally freakishly long necks. These dinosaurs had massive necks, which allowed them to raise their head nearly 30 feet off the ground to reach the leaves on the tallest trees. As the migrating herds of the titanic Brachiosaurus or Diplodocus roamed across the Jurassic savannas, they were complemented by other, smaller dinosaurs like the herbivorous Stegosaurus and the omnivorous Ankylosaurus. It's kind of odd to call these dinosaurs small. I mean, they were certainly a lot smaller than Brachiosaurus and Apatosaurus, but they weren't small by our human standards. Both the Stegosaurus and the Ankylosaurus were 2 to 4 meters long, and hugely bulky. They were animals the size of cars, except covered in scales and bony plates. There was numerous other species of small dinosaurs that lived during this time period as well. Species like the turkey-sized Compsognathus, the Microraptors, and the so-called ostrich dinosaurs. These smaller creatures scurried along in the underbrush, grazing on plants or hunting small mammals or fish, while avoiding being killed by their own predators, or by being inadvertently crushed under the foot of some giant sauropod. It should go without saying that these massive dinosaurs didn't just include all the peaceful herbivores like the Brachiosaurus and the Stegosaurus. There were also the larger carnivorous species of theropods, the wild beasts of nightmare, the iconic thunder lizards that took their role as the big bad monsters in most of the Jurassic Park movies. These theropod predators include the allosaurs and the torvosaurs, each one a towering bipedal machine of muscle and death. They all possessed powerful hind legs for sprinting after their prey, muscle-bound tails that were used as weapons and counterbalances, and perhaps most iconic, they had massive predatory skulls, whose characteristic shape can invoke a primal fear in us even today, millions of years after they've all died out. These carnivorous theropods would chase down their prey, smashing into them with their huge bulk, and biting into them with their vice-like jaws. These dinosaurs had small arms, which were relatively useless at catching prey. Instead, their diminutive arms were most likely used as stabilizing tools. During mating, the arms would be used to hold on to the other individual for physical support. During feeding, the arms would hold and restrain a prey animal that had been caught but still lived and struggled to escape. Near the end of the Jurassic period, the first protobirds began to appear. The most prominent of these protobirds is the Archaeopteryx, which is a classic and famous example of a transitional species, a species that existed somewhere in between the evolutionary history of their dinosaur ancestors and their contemporary bird descendants. The Archaeopteryx had primitive feathers, which led paleontologists and evolutionary biologists to theorize that many other dinosaur species, like the Velociraptor and the Allosaurus, might have also had some kind of feathering. Today, the modern consensus seems to be that most dinosaurs were actually covered in feathers. They weren't these naked, scale-covered reptiles as they're depicted in Jurassic Park. They were actually rather fluffy, having a full body covering of feathers. Most of these feathers were presumably used for warmth, but the feathers on the protobirds would be adapted to enable a basic ability to fly, which opened up the treetops and unreachable cliff sides, and even the sky itself as a viable habitat. Natural selection pushed these protobirds into this available niche, sculpting them to be more efficient flyers, with streamlined feathers and an aerodynamic body plan. But all of this evolutionary development didn't happen at once. These protobirds emerged in the late Jurassic, and they radiated outwards to diverge into hundreds of new species during the Cretaceous. The Cretaceous period itself lasted from 145 million years ago up until the famous KT extinction event of 66 million years ago. During this 80 million year stretch of time, the continents would continue to break up and move apart. Gondwana, the southern continent during the Jurassic period, would split up as pieces broke off the mainland and drifted away. A landmass broke off the west and drifted away to become South America. Another chunk broke off the southeast and became Australia. A large mass of land on South Gondwana broke off and slowly drifted to the South Pole, where it would become Antarctica. In the north, Laurentia was ripped apart as the northwestern landmasses drifted further west, spreading out to create Europe and breaking apart to create North America. If we go way back to the Triassic was characterized by a brutal heat, while the Jurassic enjoyed a more moderate, tropical temperature and humidity. This cooling trend would continue through the Cretaceous, which saw significantly more snowfall and ice formation than in the preceding periods. Global temperatures dipped following an increase in glaciation, although the temperatures were pushed back up a little bit by the heat of heavy volcanism that also existed throughout the period. Angiosperms, or the flowering plants, had emerged in the Triassic period. But now in the Cretaceous period, they began to diversify wildly. The angiosperms co-evolved with other recently emerged arthropod groups like bees and wasps. The conifers and other gymnosperms remained the dominant vegetable group on the planet for most of the Cretaceous, but they began to fade during the later stages of the period. Flowering plants had become more and more ubiquitous as the Cretaceous went on, and their coevolution with pollinating insects gave them an edge over their seed-bearing cousins. In the oceans, the ichthyosaurs persisted. These sea monsters continued to prowl through the Mesozoic oceans up until about 92 million years ago, when the vast bulk of ichthyosaurs were wiped out by a massive anoxic event caused by some kind of geologic process, like the eruption of undersea volcanoes that would have led to the depletion of oxygen levels in the ocean water. Naturally, these conditions weren't very favorable to many other marine species, and so the ichthyosaurs were wiped out alongside many other aquatic creatures. Like every other extinction before, when some species die out, they leave open their ecological niches to be filled by some new species, and the extinction of the ichthyosaurs was no different. Now that the ichthyosaurs had been removed as the top predator in the oceans, the sharks would step in to become the dominant predators, and alongside them, massive taxonomic groups like the stingrays and the ray-finned fishes would become abundant. These ray-finned fishes in particular were a highly plastic group, quickly adapting to a huge variety of habitats and environments. The emergent genetic and phenotypic variety of these ray-finned fishes made them kind of like evolutionary Play-Doh. They adapted to almost any aquatic environment, developing unique morphologies that turned the entire taxonomic group into an organic smorgasbord of different colors and shapes and patterns and life strategies. The vast majority of the fish in our oceans are ray-finned fishes, so the Cretaceous is the period where the primordial oceans began to look a lot like how they look today. On dry land, the archosaurian reptiles like the crocodiles and the dinosaurs continued to dominate. Much like the fish in the sea, the reptiles on the land enjoyed a high degree of genetic and phenotypic diversity. The famous Tyrannosaurus rex existed during the Cretaceous, as did other iconic dinosaurs like the Triceratops, the velociraptors, and the pterosaurs. The pterosaurs were a group of dinosaurs that could fly on their massive wings. They had emerged in the mid-Triassic, and had become increasingly common during the Jurassic until they seemed overly abundant in the Cretaceous. Much like the fish in the sea and the reptiles on the land, the reptiles in the air also considered the Cretaceous to be their golden age, although near the end of this period they started to die out for unknown reasons. Both the land and the skies were also shared by insects, who also enjoyed relatively high diversity and evolutionary success during this period. Some examples of these insect groups that all appeared and radiated and became common during this time period and diversified in their own right include the ants, and the bees and wasps, the aphids, and the locusts, among many other groups. These creatures and climates would define the Cretaceous period for its entire 80 million year duration. During the early Cretaceous, biodiversity was high as animals and plants spread out and diversified to fill the niches left open by the small extinctions that had dotted the era. As the Cretaceous period dragged on, this biodiversity slowly declined. As the climate cooled and the temperatures dropped, many species of reptile, particularly the flying pterosaurs, became less and less common, with many of these lineages dying out entirely. This slow decline in species diversity was rapidly accelerated by the end Cretaceous extinction event, which has been discussed in schools, in books, on science shows, on TV and YouTube. Basically anywhere that people talk about dinosaurs, they also talk about the end Cretaceous extinction event. Huge portions of the Earth's life were destroyed forever, consumed in a rapid and devastating shift in the planetary climate. 66 million years ago, it's believed that a massive impactor nearly 10 kilometers wide struck the Earth with a hellacious force. This collision threw millions of tons of rock and debris into the air, which choked the planet in a thick layer of dust. The light of the sun was blocked out, and the temperatures, which had been slowly cooling, suddenly dropped substantially. The plants starved and died, which subsequently led to the starvation of many herbivore species that had managed to survive the initial asteroid impact. as all things in nature exist in an ecological relationship with everything else. The death of the plants was followed by the widespread death of the herbivores, and this was followed by the widespread death of many carnivore species who relied upon the herbivores for food. Species like the Tyrannosaurus rex, the Stegosaurus, the Mosasaurus, and the Ammonites, along with thousands and thousands and thousands of others, were all wiped out in this cataclysm. It was truly a dinosaur apocalypse. No, a total apocalypse for all life, as these large creatures simply couldn't handle the cold temperatures and the lack of vegetation. In fact, most creatures couldn't handle this, and most strict herbivores and carnivores died out. The animals that persevered through this hellish time period were the omnivores, the scavengers, those who could eat anything that they could find, or who ate the dead and rotting flesh of plants and animals. And after the recent mass extinction, there was no shortage of that. The crocodiles survived because they could go into a kind of limited hibernation, and their young grew slowly and fed off the remains of other animals. The proto-mammals were able to survive because of their relatively small size and their fur, as well as their burrowing behaviors and numerous other adaptations that they had acquired while hunting in the undergrowth, in the shadow of the dinosaurs. These adaptations carried the proto-mammals through the KT extinction, where they would go on to radiate into a world emptied of dinosaurs, a world ripe for diversification. This would begin the Cenozoic era, or the Age of Mammals. And with that, we come to the end of the Mesozoic era. In the blink of a geologic eye, an asteroid has just massacred the dinosaurs and brought the age of the reptiles to a hellish end. Alright, that's it for this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, then give it a like and share it with your friends and classmates. If you're enjoying this series on evolutionary history, or if you enjoy all my content in general, then hit the subscribe button for new stuff every week. The next episode will take us into the Cenozoic era, which will see the blooming diversification of birds and mammals. If this sounds cool to you, then be sure to come by and check it out. And as always, thanks for listening.